Climate change, COVID, and now the conflict in Ukraine. This string of crises has left the world staring at a global food emergency that could last years. The UN Secretary General is warning the already looming threat from hunger and famine affecting millions is being made worse by events in Ukraine. Can the world's leaders find a solution to this crisis? Welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Seeker. The U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has accused Russia of using food as a weapon, holding hostage supplies that were not meant just for Ukrainians, but for millions around the world. Russia's UN ambassador, Vasily Nebenzia, rejected the claim as absolutely false, insisting the global food crisis has been brewing for years. So here's the issue. Russia and Ukraine supply 28% of globally traded wheat, 29% of the barley, 15% of the maize, and 75% of the sunflower oil. Conflict, sanctions, and blockades means a lot of it just can't get out. The World Food Programme estimates about 49 million people face emergency levels of hunger, while around 811 million go to bed hungry each night. Well, joining me now to talk more about this looming disaster in Barcelona, Elisabetta Aurino, Assistant Professor of Development Economics at the University of Barcelona School of Economics. In New York, Sarah Saadoun, Senior Researcher on Economic Justice at Human Rights Watch. And joining us from Edinburgh in the UK, Sherillyn Raga, Research Fellow at the ODI Global Affairs think tank. Good to have you all with us. So, Elisabetta Aurino, if I could start with you. As we were mentioning at the top there, Ukraine has certainly put this crisis front and center, but it's not all about Ukraine, is it? There's a lot more to it than that. We'll talk more about that in a moment, but just talk us through why events in Ukraine have made this more urgent.
Well, hi, everyone. So, as you said, the situation in Ukraine really put forward what was already a looming crisis creeping in the past 2 years. With Ukraine, we had, with the Ukraine invasion, we had a decrease in food supply globally because a lot of the wheat supply that Ukraine usually sent as export are stuck in some of these ports. But as you said, this situation of heightened food insecurity was already pre-existing. So the Ukraine invasion really started a perfect storm. So countries are starting to bouncing back from the pandemic, 2 years of pandemic, which we know had already catastrophic effects on food insecurity levels all around the world. Now we have around 200 million people that are facing acute food insecurity in 2021. And with this increasing food prices, this number is increasing week by week. And in the Horn of Africa, in Yemen and southern Madagascar, we had 500,000 people that are facing starvation. Also, we have other drivers that were really exacerbating this heightened food insecurity crisis. We have the climate crisis that is leading to more frequent and intense climate shocks that are hampering productivity. We have other important conflicts. I mentioned Yemen. Many countries in the Sahel region of Africa are in situation of protracted crisis and conflicts. And then we had the creeping inflation pre-existing the Ukrainian war. We saw the food price index by FAO that increased by about 26% in 2021. And also we had, with the pandemic, large disruption of food supply chains, increases in poverty, and the health shocks, of course.
And one of the issues that's brought this to the forefront in recent days is the announcement by India to ban wheat exports. And we're going to play a clip of that now. India's decision to ban wheat exports as the heat wave there is hurting the crop and domestic prices are soaring.
What it is doing is, in the name of prohibition, we are directing the wheat trade in a certain direction. We do not want wheat to go in an unregulated manner to places where it might just get either hoarded or where it may not be used to the purpose which we are hoping it would be used for, which is serving the food requirements of vulnerable nations and vulnerable people.
Now, if I could turn to Sherillyn Raga on this, what effect do you think will India's decision have on the food markets?
Yes, I also have seen the announcement of India on the terms of their export restrictions, but we also must remember that there are other countries, about 20 other countries that have recently announced export bans on certain grains, food, and oil products. So all of this would exacerbate the price hikes, but also would induce price volatility worldwide. So what we've seen, these export restrictions, these are not new. We've seen this during the commodity shock prices in 2006 to 2008. But what we've learned during those period is that these export restrictions tend to exacerbate, the fluctuations of global prices of commodities and food, and also exacerbates the food insecurity. So unless we implement some mitigating measures on calming, the commodity price shock, then I'm sure we will experience higher prices that will push inflation up, and this will all have compounding effects on food insecurity.
Sarah Saadoun, what in your view are the implications of all this for global food insecurity?
The export restrictions reflect a predicament that governments find themselves in, where they are unable to fully control for price volatility because of structural problems in global markets. And so the important thing is to learn from this crisis, particularly as Elisabetta said, that these shocks are only going to continue with climate change, to really address the underlying problem that is making food more expensive. And something that is really important to keep in mind in this crisis is that this is not a problem of food shortage. This is a problem of food distribution and food pricing, and how governments, how the supply chains of food, how concentration in markets where more governments are reliant on imports, and only a few countries make up the vast majority of the amount of food being exported. But at the same time, speculation in commodities markets and other factors drive prices up far beyond what the market actually would require. And so the important thing is to address the underlying problems that lead to export restrictions in the first place.
Elisabetta Aurino, I saw you nodding in agreement to some of that. This idea that it isn't just a lack of food supply, it's the structural problems in place right now that are making things worse.
Yeah, I can't agree more with my colleague here. So what is important to stress is that there is enough food to feed everyone in the world. If we look at stock to consumption ratio, this is usually a good measure of how food availability there is at the global level. And actually, these are slightly increasing compared to 2020. So we have enough food to feed everyone, but the problem is really distribution. So move this food where there is enough to places that are now suffering more to get this food, and also within each country, to redistribute foods to low-income groups, or, for instance, groups that are especially vulnerable, such as children, the elderly, or women.
I want to play a clip now of the UN Secretary General, who we also mentioned at the top there, and what he said about this crisis.
Russia must permit the safe and secure export of grain stored in Ukrainian ports. Alternative transportation routes can be explored, even if we know that by itself they will not be enough to solve the problem. And Russian food and fertilizers must have unrestricted access to world markets without indirect impediments.
So Sherillyn Raga, he seems to be touching on something, an accusation that's already been made, that Russia is now using food as a weapon here in its efforts in the war in Ukraine.
Well, yeah. So I think food, as in normal times and in conflict times, it's a sensitive issue for many countries, especially on their concept of self-sufficiency in normal, but also more so in conflict and economic downturns time. So I think food as a weapon, the impact of food in terms of prices, supply shortages is rather a damage of the war, but not maybe as a weapon. But I think when I work with Yemen, what we've seen is that when political conflict expands to an economic war, then the implication on food insecurity gets worse. So the question here is whether there is room for Russia and Ukraine and for the international community to intervene on whether there is a pragmatic solution to insulate the food and food inputs trade so that this trade is insulated from attacks, and where food is needed, they can be safely delivered, and where there are food surplus, they can be delivered to those who are in deficit, and especially those who need them the most. In our ODI research, what we found is that the countries that need us the most are those who have pre-existing structural impediments and humanitarian needs. We're talking about like Sudan and Yemen in this case. So yeah, we have to have a collective effort on how to address this blockages in terms of shipment of food, especially through the Black Sea.
All right, we're going to put up a graphic now that gives you an idea of just how acute this problem is in terms of who the main wheat exporters are in the country. And these are the top 5 wheat exporters in the world by country. Russia at the top, $7.3 billion. That's 13% of total wheat exports, followed by the United States, $7.29 billion. That's around 13% as well. Australia, $7.2 billion. Canada, $6.6 billion. And the 5th, Ukraine, $4.7 billion. So that kind of sort of sums it up in a nutshell, in that you have a war right now. Two of the countries in that war are supplying a very large portion of the wheat supply in the world. So that's why this has come to the fore in recent times. But Sarah Saadoun, if I could turn back to you on this, who do you think is going to suffer the most in the short term, the longer those wheat supplies don't come out of Ukraine?
The same people who always suffer, regardless of what the crisis is: poor people, low-income people, older people, people with disabilities, people who face structural discrimination that impacts their livelihood, people with illnesses, people with young children. But I'd like to also take a second to explain what it means to be food insecure. So all people have the right to adequate and nutritious food to allow for a healthy life. So that means that they need both enough food, but also that the quality of food is nutritious enough. And we have today around 1 in 3 people don't get an adequate amount of nutritious food for a healthy life. And over 800 million people don't get enough food. And that the number of food insecure people increased by 320 million in 2020 alone from the pandemic, before these price increases. Another thing to realize is that one of the ways in which governments can make sure that people get enough affordable food, can afford enough food, is through social protection systems. But half of the world's population don't have access to any social protection. That means unemployment. That means disability insurance. That means pensions. But something to help if they are unable to earn enough money to afford food. So this comes in a context where the pandemic has already increased poverty and food insecurity, and budgets are already overstretched, and a huge number of people do not have the support that they need to make sure that they can afford enough nutritious food.
And Sherillyn Raga, which countries are the most vulnerable the longer this goes on?
Yes, so again, what we're speaking of right now is the food insecurity angle of the war, but the effects of this Russia and Ukraine war extends beyond the food security and also can have a loop or a second round of effects to this as well. So we look at the vulnerabilities of 118 developing countries worldwide to the economic fallout of the Russia and Ukraine war, and including their net position on food, but also in different aspects of the economy. So first factor we look is that their direct exposure to the war, whether they have direct links to Russia and Ukraine in terms of trade, investment, migrants. We also look at countries' global exposure to the effects of the war in terms of commodity prices, whether they are net importer of food, but also fuel, and also fertilizers and other commodities, as well as their exposure, their reliance on remittances and tourism activities. But more so, we look at the factors such as how are the policy space going on in this country, especially coming out of the war, where many countries experience soaring public debts and also lower foreign reserves. By looking at these different factors of vulnerability, what we found is that the former USSR countries, especially Belarus, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, these are the most vulnerable to the economic fallout of the war, but also others that are remotely located from Russia and Ukraine, such as Lebanon, Maldives, and Montenegro, just because of the nature of their exposure to the global effects in terms of trade and prices and financial flows.
Elisabetta Aurino, if we look at alternatives to this, while the war in Ukraine continues and these supplies are disrupted, the European leaders have been talking about this over the last couple of days. Are there any alternative routes that can be set up for the export specifically of Ukrainian grain?
So I think, as I said previously, that we have enough stocks at a global level. So there is way to ship, for instance, from the US, from Canada, from China. There are other countries that can supply and these foods. What I also want to shed light on is the role of social protection, as Sarah also mentioned. So it's not just about shipping foods, but also supporting households, for instance, in African settings, through cash to purchase locally grown foods. That because this could also support the local agriculture to kind of get back on these feet after the COVID crisis. So cash is a very important way to support these households through this crisis.
And Sherillyn Raga, is there? Do you see alternatives to? I mean, are there other farmers out there who can make up the shortfall the longer this goes on?
So what we know is that, of course, Russia and Ukraine are major exporters of these grains, but there are other producers as well in the world. But the problem is, how do you make markets open? So the problem is not, so as we've said, as was what Sarah was describing earlier, whether you are food insecure, it depends on your food affordability, whether you can afford it based on your income, or whether your income is not eroded by inflation, or you have physical access to these commodities, in terms of okay, you might be in a high income household or high income economy, but if you cannot access the food that's coming from Ukraine, then you can also still be food insecure. So what we're saying is that it's important in this time to keep the markets open. There is a space for instance, in the upcoming ministerial meeting of the WTO in June, to talk about this important issue of export restrictions. We have to keep market open so that those who have deficit can access it, and so that these restrictions don't further, intensify the price volatilities in the market and drive prices up. So yeah, I think there are options to do this. We've seen how PPE medical goods have been facilitated during the pandemic. I'm sure if the world leaders put their goal into this, trade can be facilitated in a faster and more efficient way at this time of crisis.
Sarah Saadoun, what do you see then as some of the structural problems that increase price volatility, particularly the speculation in the commodities markets?
Yes, this is a very important issue. There was a report released this month by the independent panel of experts on sustainable food systems that identified speculation as one of the main drivers of price increases. A group of UN human rights experts have also identified this as a major impediment to fulfilling people's right to food. And this is a huge problem where investors are actually getting rich off of price increases, or panic drives prices up beyond what the market actually would require. As we've all mentioned, this is not a problem where there's food shortages. Certainly, there are problems with distribution that can affect prices, but the price increases go far beyond what the expense of redistributing food would require. And this is because investors are allowed to, there's excessive speculation on the markets that drive prices up and allow investors to get rich off of people going hungry.
Elisabetta Aurino, how long do you think this could last? I mean, as far as is this something that could we be talking years here? I mean, even if the war was to end tomorrow.
So this is as we discussed earlier. So this is a problem that was actually existing before the war, and the war just exacerbated it. So we'll probably talk about this for a while. So the FAO has foreseen that this food price increase will last at least until 2024. And that's why we really need to work as a global community to act upon this through through a kind of global, concerted, and also multifaceted response, because this is such a complex issue. So again, talking about supporting households through social protection systems, school meals, but also supporting the same farmers. So together with the increase in food prices, we also have increases in energy prices and fertilizer prices. So we need to ensure to support farmers to keep producing for not just this harvest, but the next ones. And as Sarah mentioned, trying to kind of fix the speculation. This was something that we failed already after the global financial crisis of 2008. This was something, the speculation on food prices was something that was already flagged by then, but then we really failed as a global community to enact and regulate better this sector by recognizing that food is not a commodity as other commodities. It's a key political, human rights, and very sensitive issue. And also building resilience, especially in face of the climate crisis. This is something that unfortunately will stay, and as we experience globally, we have these shocks. We have these climate shocks that are really hampering the production of food. So we really need to work to manage these agricultural risks that will become more and more pronounced in the coming years, and invest in crops that are more climate resilient.
Sherillyn Raga, in the best case scenario, how quickly you think could the world recover from these shortages?
So yeah, it's a very difficult question, but what we've seen is that, the global financial markets, where this global commodity prices also, play around, they can instantly respond into a very, quick signals of positive progress towards ending the war. So as we speak, the best solution always is to end this war, or even like signal some progress towards negotiations towards ending this. And you can quickly see how markets adjust quickly. I think the more important issue is not besides the prices, is also, what we've talked about in this session, is the distribution. How far and how fast can we recover in getting the physical access of this food. And this will all fall down into increased cooperation and increased coordination between, ports, land distribution, international and local policies on trade, whether, how do you lift export restrictions in terms of bans or in terms of high tariffs, how do you facilitate all these shipments, all how fast we get the prices might go down faster if we progress on the our efforts towards peace, but the distribution is a matter of question and time on how intense the coordination will be at the ground.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks very much to all of our guests, Elisabetta Aurino, Sarah Saadoun, and Sherillyn Raga. Thanks very much for being on Roundtable. And remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and all the team here, goodbye, and thanks for watching.